or lease in the morning.
What's poppin', players? Take two. Welcome to another edition of Breaking Badger News. I am your host, as always, the friendly neighborhood John Deskin Simpsons can. No, I do not have hepatitis. For the tens of people who have been asking me about that. It's just a lifestyle choice. It works for me. Get over it. And joining me for this particular edition of the show is, I think we agreed to refer to as she who must be obeyed.
Yes,
right?
Yes, that's absolutely right. She who must be obeyed.
Okay, just making sure. Anyways, let's get just right into the details of this particular story. So, there's this institution called the Law Society of Upper Canada, obviously within Canada, and it's made up of lawyers and paralegals for the purpose of self-regulation. Their main function is to ensure that, quote-unquote, persons who practice law in Ontario were competent, followed proper procedures, and behaved ethically. And it seems pretty standard bureaucratic nonsense, just making sure that everybody's doing their jobs properly. Although, interesting little bit of news. A recent message received by all lawyers throughout Canada was called the New Obligations for 2017. This was in the subject line for this email. And this was brought to my attention. I'm not a lawyer, although I appreciate if you think I had the intellect level to be a lawyer. Feel free to put that in the comments below. This was brought to my attention by Bruce Party, a professor of law at Queen's University and a member of the Law Society. He wrote a column for the National Post on October 3rd regarding this email. And what this email said was that all lawyers must prepare and submit a personal statement of principles attesting that we value and promote equality, diversity, and inclusion. The intention of the State of Principles is to demonstrate a personal valuing of equality, diversity, and inclusion with respect to the employment of others or in professional dealings with other licensees or any other person. This follows a report done by a working group created by the Law Society back in 2012, and the report came out 4 years later. I don't know why it took them 4 years to investigate this, but they said they reported findings of systemic racism in the legal profession. Where the data is for this, I do not know. I can only assume, based on my own cynicism, that the reason why they found systemic racism was probably because there wasn't an equal number of people of certain ethnicities within the legal profession. But I could be completely wrong about that. The Law Society accepted the working group's recommendations, one of which is a requirement of the aforementioned personal statement of principles, which requires not just compliance with the law, but concurrence. Party argues that the core of free speech is the liberty to criticize the content of the law, and lawyers, above all, must be able to do this. I certainly agree with that. Party cites one side of the debate regarding anti-discrimination laws, particularly from Richard Epstein, a prominent American legal scholar. And in his 1992 book, Forbidding Grounds, the case against employment discrimination laws, Epstein argued that the laws set one group against another, impose limits on freedom of choice, unleash bureaucratic excesses, mandate inefficient employment practices, and cause far more invidious discrimination than they prevent. Now, regardless of whether or not Epstein is wrong, the Law Society's new requirement effectively prohibits Ontario lawyers from engaging in that debate. Now, Karen, confirm or deny my suspicions regarding this. When they say stuff like equality, diversity, how much do you want to bet that equality actually means equity?
Yeah,
that sort of thing?
That's going to be, particularly given that this is Canada. I would suggest that the legal profession is still predominantly white in Canada, and that may not reflect the spectrum of skin color in the proportions that the government would really like to see in that profession, but it will be about having proportional representation within the profession. So if blacks are 6% of the population, they want blacks to be 6% of lawyers. So equal outcomes is what they want, and they except when women overshoot it and women become a majority in anything, and then they just don't care. But Canada has a very slanted idea of what equality and diversity are. It's kind of like in Australia, where 60% of government workers are women, and they still have preferential hiring and promotion of women there. So essentially, what we're seeing is the same old, same old. And as far as the data, if they're not revealing exactly, like in the report, where they're getting this data from, how they actually measured this, detected and measured all of this systemic bias, I can almost guarantee you it's because it's a less reliable way of measuring it. So they're not looking at double blind studies and experiments and stuff. What they're doing is they're relying on self-reports. And right now, you know, in order to feel discriminated against, you have to feel discriminated against, and that doesn't necessarily mean you are being discriminated against. And so essentially, given how prevalent and how big this whole topic is right now in the media, I would suggest that you're going to get a lot of false positives where people feel like they have been discriminated against when they actually have not. So, you know, and we're talking like massively overblown things, you know, with microaggressions and things like that. Somebody asking, you know, where are you from? And you say Calgary, and they're like, no, where are you really from? Because, you know, you are Asian, and you maybe even have an Asian accent. Well, yeah, you're from Calgary, but where's your family from, right? You know, like people are maybe curious about that, but that, even just asking that, is considered a microaggression these days. So, and that would be systemic bias against Asians or whatever, right? So that's really what they're probably relying on is self-report data and survey data. How have you felt discriminated against? Well, you know, that's really not that useful, particularly when the entire media is telling people you're being discriminated against.
Yeah, so it's a particularly difficult thing to measure. Like, I've been discriminated against on the basis of my skin, and people just don't seem to legitimize that base, because I tell them I'm yellow-skinned and I'm from the town of Springfield, USA, but they just don't seem to believe me. It's really demeaning to my state of being, you know, Karen?
I bet they want to know what state you're from as well, and, you know, and that's just rude to even ask.
Okay, yeah, and I don't have to enact the labor to tell them what state I'm from. And I'm really glad that you're able to reference that particular joke from The Simpsons.
There you go.
But yeah, it's just when it comes to these types of policies and trying to create data to back up the reason for their implementation, I don't understand how you can measure that. It sort of goes back to those unconscious bias tests. How did those come about? How have their methods been vetted?
Well,
they haven't.
Yeah, no, they believe that an unconscious bias test would be able to measure, and or an implicit bias test, implicit association test, they sometimes call them, and maybe there is something to tell there. Maybe that there is some kind of, but just because you have an implicit bias or an implicit association in your subconscious does not necessarily mean you're going to act on it. It doesn't necessarily mean you're going to treat people any differently based on their skin color or their gender or whatever. It just means that you have a particular perception of them in your subconscious, right? And if you look at things like being polite, are designed, like civility is designed to level out all of that as much as possible. Having rules, social rules around how people interact is designed to level those things out. So, I mean, honestly, it's getting ridiculous, and there is no science out there that takes implicit bias training or unconscious or subconscious bias training and finds that it has been successful. There's no research out there that has actually confirmed that it does any good. What little research there is it's mixed, and it leans towards it actually increases racial tensions in the workplace.
Well, of course it does, because when you're doing something like that and trying to place such importance on race, people, like you said, unconsciously start to validate that particular perspective of the world.
Well,
and that's not healthy.
They're not just on race, but on difference, right? Cultural difference, right? So, and then on top of that, essentially saying to people, you have to respect these differences, but you aren't allowed to be curious about them. And if you ask somebody about their culture, then that's actually a microaggression. So, you know, the whole thing is, and one thing that I found really interesting is that every time, you know, because I have asked the two Muslim men that I worked with who were both from Lebanon, had immigrated here.
Right.
I have talked to them extensivly about their culture and, you know, the laws back home, and, you know, how does marriage work in your culture? How do men and women, what are the gender roles? What are the obligations and all of that? And they were actually really happy to tell me. They were just like, oh my God, somebody's interested in a non-judgmental way about how my culture operates. That's great, right? So I think that a lot of this idea that not asking, right, not asking about these things is the polite thing to do, when in reality I think asking is going to get you answers that will help you understand those and find similarities as well as differences, right? So yeah. I think we're going about everything exactly the wrong way. And as far as the freedom of speech issue, like, I think that every lawyer out there can write his statement of principles or whatever the fuck it is, and then continue to criticize the law and the policies and all of these things. But that's maybe going to get him censured by the Law Society if he actually submits these principles and then comes out later and says, I mean, he still has the right to criticize the law, but he's maybe going to have a hard time within the Law Society if he's perceived as going back on a pledge that he has made, essentially.
Yeah, and it really bothers me that when it comes to this type of these statements and these motions that are going through the Canadian legal system, like this, and obviously Motion 103, Bill C-16, in terms of compelled speech, that what's most bothersome about it is the fact that the terminology that they're using is so broad. And there doesn't seem to be much room for nuance in these particular circumstances. You're either for equality or you're not. Well, see, here's the thing. I believe I speak for myself and Karen when I say that both of us are for equality and diversity and inclusion. What we're not for is stuff like equity, quality of outcome. We're not for diversity when it comes to just trying to forsake meritocracy and just trying to, you know, hire people on the basis of superficial characteristics, that sort of thing. And unless we can have that discussion, then we can't really do stuff in a natural way so that people can integrate themselves into society. And, you know, it's like what you said with the way that you've interacted with your coworkers, and the same way that I interacted with mine, when you're trying to police that sort of thing. Natural relationships can't burgeon, and you can't create a healthy working environment that way. It just creates tension, and that's not good.
That's right.
Anyways.
I did want to say that, you know, because I think it's relevant in this context, is in Australia when they did their, launched a program where promotions to, you know, in order to, when people would put themselves forward for promotions, they would scrub their names from, and all of the information on gender from their CV, and, they actually found women were less likely to be hired after, in a double-blind situation like that. In a gender-blinded situation, women were less likely to be hired than they had been previously, and men were more likely to be hired. So we're actually seeing some of these measures. There is some bias, but the bias is not necessarily what we think it is. So
yeah, it's it's not racism, guys. In the most circumstances, you're just really desperate to try and find stuff like this. This microaggression stuff, just stop.
Yeah.
Just stop it.
Yeah, it needs to stop.
Anyways, before we go to just shilling stuff and telling you guys to like stuff, I just wanted to say, if you happen to be a lawyer in Canada, if you're a part of the Law Society, there is something that you can do. You can go to a website set up by a very popular man on the interwebs nowadays. His name is Jordan Peterson. You can go to his website. I believe it's either jordanpeterson.com or jordanbpeterson.com. And one of his most recent posts is addressing this particular issue. And what you can do is you can click on that post, go and just scroll down, and you can put in your information and just say that you decry what the Law Society is trying to do. And don't worry, it's all confidential. So if you don't want your name out there, it's being kept completely private. They just need to know if you truly are a lawyer, so that way they can present this petition to the right people. We'll make sure we'll also put a link to that in the comment section below. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us for this particular edition of Breaking Badger News. If you want to see more content like this, we recommend that you hit that subscribe button. Honey Badger Radio is always producing tons of videos every single week, from not just me, but from everybody else, including Allison and Karen and Dr. Random Cam and Brian. We got great stuff here, trust me. I'm trying to sound like Donald Trump. If you like this particular video, make sure you...
It's tremendous.
It's huge. We're going to be great. I can't top the way that Brian does it. Also, if you want to continue the discussion, make sure to leave a comment down below. We'd love to hear what you guys say, whether you agree or disagree. Just keep that conversation going. I want to thank Karen for doing this with me on such short notice. That'll do it for us. And until next time, have a lovely, lovely day.